Why are we here? Are we simply the product of millions of years of biology and evolution? Or is there a deeper meaning toward our existence at this particular time and at this particular circumstances? The questions regarding our existences seem to be one of the most fundamental questions in our lives, but we seem to avoid asking ourselves, what truly is our purpose in this life? Is it because we are aware of the absurdity of existence or the needless suffering that comes with existence, so we avoid such dreaded questions? Look around long enough, and we will realize that life is filled with suffering. Diseases, natural disasters, wars, hunger, all are forms of suffering that many people deal with. Some are lucky enough to be born in an environment of peace and abundance, but still, disease and the mundane regarding existence is unavoidable. Every living creature deals with suffering as we have emotion. But what distinguishes humans from animals is our consciousness of such suffering. The best we could hope for would be insights that left us feeling common, ordinary, everyday unhappiness, said Sigmund Freud. The shared human experience is, according to Freud, unhappiness or suffering. On the Suffering of the World, Schopenhauer introduces the notion that lives are full of suffering. Unless suffering is the direct and immediate object of life, our existence must be the entire fail of its aim, claimed Schopenhauer. Here, suffering and dissatisfaction is the rule of life, not an exception. Life in of itself is confusing, and it is filled with all kinds of things that may or may not bring about chaos and suffering. In the myth of Sisyphus, Albert Camus explored the absurdity of Sisyphus. Sisyphus, for his defiance of death, received a punishment by the gods to push a boulder up the hill, only to have the boulder rolling back down again. Sisyphus is then to repeat this task for eternity. Camus recognized the same absurdity within the modern men, as we are also engaging in the same eternal suffering with our meaningless office and factory jobs with no end in sight. Just like Sisyphus, much of our days are spent in jobs that we dislike, and we know there is no ending to our suffering, yet we still engage in such punishment, albeit Sisyphus did not have a choice. However, the story of Sisyphus is only tragic if Sisyphus himself finds hope in his eternal suffering. Thus, according to Camus, we are the absurd man because we live in awareness of the absurdity of our existence while holding out hope. However, from a very young age we were taught to have faith and dream big. Then the reason we suffer is not only our consciousness of the absurdity and the suffering of our existence, but because we are taught to have hope and faith for the future, a better one to be exact. Yet many of us are unaware that we are just a lamb to the slaughter, unable to stop the passage of time and the disappointment that comes with life. For instance, Schopenhauer gave an example of how two childhood friends would become disappointed if they were to meet at old age, as they are reminded that life promised them so much during their youth, but delivered so little. Isn't this the same predicament that many of us came from? This is related to the notion of humans' ability to think of the past and the future. Because we are able to distinguish time from the past, the present, and the future, we either live in regret, despair, or ecstasy of the future, which constitutes much of our suffering. In Buddhism, karma is an important concept that governs our lives. The word karma is derived from Sanskrit for the word that means action. So karma is the law regarding cause and effect, meaning every action will bring about a certain result, and in every action, there is a motivation behind it. Planting an apple seed will not result in an orange tree, but an apple tree. Thus, our action will yield the result either immediately or in later time. So the fruit of suffering stems from our action, and the action of others as well. Another important concept of karma is that it also governs the cycle of rebirth and death, which is called as samsara. This cycle of rebirth, mundane existence, and dying again is central to Buddhism, as samsara is considered to be unsatisfactory and painful, perpetuated by desire and ignorance. From an inconstruable beginning comes transmigration. A beginning point is not evident, though beings hindered by ignorance and fettered by craving are transmigrating and wandering on. This is the description of the human existence in samsara. Hence, our existence is filled with nothing but suffering, lack of purposes and direction, and finally, a never-ending cycle of repetition of such existence through rebirth. Though upon such a realization, many of us seek to avoid our suffering through external validations such as accomplishments, wealth, or fame. However, we never really once stop and ask ourselves if all these worldly things really bring about the end of suffering, or merely serve as a temporary distraction to the ailment of our existence, once fulfilled, if it were to ever to truly be fully fulfilled at all, will bring about the end of our suffering. As a result of such a wish to bring about the end of suffering, much of our daily existence is usually in the pursuit of either wealth, righteousness, pleasure, or liberation. We work to gain certain liberation or to obtain wealth, but many of us find our work toilsome and unenjoyable. So after work we seek pleasure either indulgent in alcohol, entertainment, hobby, or any other forms that brings us joy. No matter what is acting as our motivation in the pursuit of these four basic human desires, we are still within the cycle of suffering. For example, the pursuit of the desired object, such as material wealth, requires sacrifice and effort, hence suffering. The maintenance or the protection of our obtained gains is once again involving a certain kind of suffering. We once again suffer when we lose the thing we suffered so much for. Thus, the only two viable options to truly rid ourselves of suffering is either death or the end of our desires. That is because although we as humans seek to understand the world around us, we are also a creature of desire. Our desires are endless, and the world's potential to satisfy them is insufficient. Thus, we suffer endlessly during our existence. To Schopenhauer, what constitutes much of human suffering is humanity's expectation, hopes, desires, and anything from humanity's imagination. He continues to argue that humanity's ability to reflect upon either the past or the future is what results in both despair and ecstasy in our lives. Thus, we either desire to change the past or obtain certain things from the future to quench our present desire. As long as we live, we will continue to desire as desire is evolutionarily advantageous. Food and security are essential for our survival, and a partner is important to pass on our genetic materials. So, we could only hope to live with meaning in this endless cycle of desires and suffering. In The World as Will and Representation by Schopenhauer, he concluded that emotional, physical, and sexual desire causes suffering that could never be truly fulfilled. This may be true, but aren't such desires a biological and evolutionary one? Is humanity a flawed specimen then when the biological objectives of our own existence is the root cause of our suffering? If children were brought into the world by an act of pure reason alone, would the human race continue to exist? Said Schopenhauer. For Schopenhauer, humanity is motivated by our pain, such as hunger and thirst. So we seek to quench such desire, which he considered to be as happiness, which is just merely the absence of suffering. But such a source of suffering is like a cycle. There will be time of suffering and the absence of suffering, and this cycle continues until we cease to exist. In this life, no matter what we achieve or how much of our desires is quenched, all will come to an end. Flowers bloom, but they will fade and die with the passage of time. We must then question ourselves, if we are fully aware that our existence is temporal, why do we actively seek to suffer in order to quench our desires? Just like Sisyphus, our life will become tragic the moment we are aware of our absurdity, while still holding out hope. We are well aware of the absurdity and suffering that exists, but we want to find happiness, or merely a distraction from the fact that we are suffering, dying, and alone in this world. One aspect of life that caused us suffering that we tend to overlook is our free will. What is free will? Free will is the ability to decide any course of action spontaneously, without requiring the permission of others. Free will is attributed as a positive thing regarding life, and in a sense it is. No one wants to be under the influence of others, where their entire livelihood is dictated by another individual. However, just like all things in life, there are two sides to such a concept. On one hand, we are free to do whatever that we wish, while on the other, the burden of responsibility that comes with free will is overwhelming, which may lead to regrets or indulgence in the delusion of the future. Although free will allows us to make infinite choices, it does not guarantee the outcome that we wish for. So if the outcome is contrary to that of our expectation, we will feel disappointed. Many of us then dwell on the past decisions that we have made or not made, leading to regrets. The immense pressure to make the right decisions from infinite possibilities does take a toll on the body and mind. Career, university, and relationship are all examples of the infinite choices that are for the choosing. Yet, paradoxically, we either end up suffering or disappointed with our own decision, regardless of whatever we pick. The dissatisfaction feeling that we usually feel after a quote-unquote bad decision is made is hard to shake off. The past is not within our control, while to a certain extent the future is within our control. But we should never dwell in either, as it is a dangerous path to take. The past could not be changed, so if you are only deriving the feeling of regret or grief from the recalling of the past, then we are just carrying unnecessary grief and disappointment with us everywhere we go, regardless of our actions or inactions to a decision. On the other hand, if we worry too much about the future, we will never live in the present. Although emotions such as regrets and ecstasy of the future are irrational from almost every perspective, and we are very much aware of such irrationality, yet we still entertain such thoughts on a daily basis. We want liberation from the present suffering through free will, but absolute liberation leads to absolute suffering and disappointment. This then circles back to the existential crisis that many people feel, whether that be in their 20s or 50s. Although the symptoms vary between ages, the one defining aspect of an existential crisis is the lack of meaning or purpose in life. Nietzsche said, "To live is to suffer, to survive is to find some meaning in the suffering." Many, however, fail to find meaning in their suffering, so we end up needlessly suffering without any grandiose goal to keep us motivated through our struggles. This then either leads us through a path of substance or medication abuse, or living life without actual joy or goals to push us forward. This path is an easy path to choose, but the long-term consequences of such a decision will undoubtedly lead to more suffering and disappointment. As when we look at this retrospectively, not through the lens of regret but of a constructive recalling, we will realize that this is redundant suffering. Looking at life through the viewpoint of certain philosophical perspectives may give us a deeper insight to our suffering and disappointment. The nihilist believe that there is no meaning to life. There are no loyalties, nor intrinsic meaning or value to life in existential nihilism. Thus, if we were to subscribe to the viewpoint of the nihilists, should we ask ourselves that the only reason we are here is that there are no reasons? Then why must we have desires, which leads to much suffering and disappointment? If there is no reason, then why must we hold out hope and become an absurd man? If there is no reason, then why does humankind continue to exist in this cycle of never-ending suffering? One beautiful thing out of the absurdity and the acceptance of the notion that our existence is nothing but suffering and disappointment is that once we recognize the absurdity of life or the meaningless suffering of it, it really does not justify suicide. What Camus and Buddha have explored is not pessimism, but contrary to it. We must not foolishly deceive ourselves of the non-existence of suffering or the absurdity that comes with life, but acknowledge it, and instead of suicide, a revolt is necessary from such an understanding of life. Although we are doomed to eternal suffering and disappointment, it does not necessarily mean that we should seek to cease to exist, but instead find a purpose within our existence, regardless of the suffering and absurdity of it. That is what it means to live. Everybody struggles with the inherent suffering of life, but as humans we are also inherently curious animals that seek to find meaning and purpose in our lives. If the world is inherently meaningless, then our actions, thoughts, and concerns become trivial. So another viewpoint of the absurdity of life is that it grants us the strength to pursue anything we want, since nothing truly matters. Another perspective regarding Sisyphus is to imagine Sisyphus happy. Although Sisyphus recognized the absurdity of his task, yet each day he continues to push the boulder up the cliff. Same with the modern men, we may have come to the realization of the lack of meaning and the absurdity of our jobs earlier in life. But regardless of such fate, we do not resign to it, and instead, we take responsibility for our own lives and push on, day by day. Thus, just like Camus argues, we accept the hopelessness of the human condition, but still continue to carry on regardless. Additionally, we could also find comfort knowing the fact that the collective humanity experience is suffering. Suffering is what makes humans, humans. Then we know that we are not alone in this world after all, as we share much of the same predicament as every person that has ever lived and will ever live. Schopenhauer explored that the main motivation for humanity is suffering, such as thirst and hunger. But we could also use such a motivation for personal development. No matter what it is, life is worth living regardless of the lack of meaning or the suffering and disappointment that exists, as to live is to suffer. But we could give meaning to life based on our values and experiences.